Hi, hello everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thanks for joining this, what seems to be a very interesting topic and a great session with my friends and partners, Sue and Jason from SaaS Chain. They don't need an introduction. We have been together a few times, and this is a series of our webinars. On this one, I think which is even more interesting because this is an area which is close to my heart, but it's also a significant area of expertise for both Sue and Jason. So Sue, Jason, welcome to the webinar and welcome to all the attendees, and let's get going. Before we begin, there is one observation, Sue, I have to share with all the attendees. I've been talking to you last couple of months, and every time I speak to you, you are in a different location. So you're at the beach, you are at the vineyard, you are in the hills. So the lesson is for whoever is hearing this or will hear the recording is please listen extra carefully to what Sue's saying, because whatever she's doing is working very well for her. She's in all these exotic locations all the time. So, but yeah, thank you, Sue and Jason, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prithvi. It's always a pleasure. And I can give some travel tips as well if anyone wants them. So,
yeah, of course. We should have a separate session just covering your travels and do a travel log of sorts.
yes.
Wonderful. So this topic of change management, and obviously this is something SaaS Chain is sort of very, very good at. Let's start by one of you defining what does change management mean to a SaaS organization. And there's so many definitions, people have their own perspectives of this. Maybe one of you can help us understand what is change management.
Yeah, do you want me to start the ball rolling, Jason, or do you want to go for that?
No, go for it, Sue.
Okay, yeah. Well, for me, change management, particularly in SaaS, is when we're trying to help our customers. And the customers, there's usually two levels of granularity. It's the stakeholders and the end users to move from some kind of known present. It's usually some kind of comfort zone, but it's not all that comfortable, in fact, because obviously they wouldn't be investing in software in the first place, to a future which is not yet known. And this future obviously represents some kind of improvements. And I think the big challenge is that a lot of people, because it's software and because software is so abundant now and it's so easily accessible, that they think that software now is practically just plug and play. And they forget that it's not just about plug and play. They forget there's a whole lot of other things that need to be taken into consideration into the equation, but we can go into that into detail later on. And Jason, I'll let you add your version of that as well, if you like.
Right, and I agree with everything Sue said. I think the thing I would add on to it is it's really about helping individuals learn new ways of working and learning new habits at work and new ways of doing their job on a daily basis to not only use the new software technology, but use it in such a way that they are successful, but also everyone else in their organization is successful. And I think that's really one of the keys, because many times I've seen individual users can adopt a software in a way that they do their job well, but either they're putting information in late, or they're not putting stuff in, or they're using it another way that other people in the organization, especially those downstream, are not able to do their job effectively using the software. So I think there's a huge change management involves a huge coordination effort and focus effort to get all the different players to work well and play nicely in the sandbox.
Wonderful, wonderful. So this really is from a this state to a that state, and hoping for some improvement. And most organizations try to move or transform their outcomes or their efficiencies, and which is why they're choosing a particular software. And they're currently doing it in some shape or form, or not doing it in any shape or form. It still warrants a change in their behavior, like you mentioned. So I think it's a very important aspect. It often gets missed out. People, and we will discuss this in more detail, people treat this as training, people treat this as onboarding, but you have to identify those states. So what does it mean? Let me ask a little bit more granular level question now on change management. It's a very good definition you have provided. What does it mean for the vendor, one, and what does it mean for the buyer?
Yeah, I will start with the vendor. I think a lot of the time when we're talking about change management, we often confuse it with user adoption, right?
Mhm.
User adoption is key, it's critical, so that your customers are actually gaining some kind of benefits, some kind of outcomes afterwards. But user adoption is just one element of that change management. And I think a lot of vendors, when we're talking about user adoption and change management, they're overlapping them. And they're always thinking that perhaps this is part of their responsibility. In fact, it's not. For me, change management can only be legitimately the responsibility of your customers.
Mhm.
You, as a vendor, you can guide them, you can provide guidelines as to what they should be doing in terms of change management, but
Mhm.
you cannot do the change management on their behalf. So there are lots of things we can do as a vendor to help the customer. Jason, I'll probably let you answer the question about the customer.
Sure, I appreciate
Yeah.
that. And Sue, I completely agree with your point that the vendor can't do it. And I think part of the reason, even just, why we even have customer success and we're talking about this is their buyers, their customers, they're not very good at doing change management and they can get a system live, but getting people to use the system is a big challenge. And they don't necessarily know how to approach that or what to do with it. And ultimately, that's where, if the customer was good at driving change and getting value on their own, there would be no need for customer success. But since they really fall down in that area, it's a big challenge. When I look at change management from the customer's point of view, I think it really is that how do we change the day-to-day habits? But when you look at how do you do that, you need to have someone who's responsible for that, who is skilled at it and understands what are the steps and processes it takes to really help an organization pivot. And I find it helpful to look at change management from the lens of people also do change outside of technology. So if you've done an acquisition and you're trying to integrate people into an organization, or new regulations have come in that you need to comply with and other things, there's a change management effort there. And folks sort of understand that needs to happen, and that there's a huge effort to make those transitions, but they don't always assume that similar transitions are needed for technology. And I think the other piece, and we'll probably talk about this in a bit too, is that people view a technology change that the method should be the same as it is for a one-off change of we did a merger, we did an acquisition, whereas the technology doesn't stay static, and there's constantly releases, there's constantly evolutions coming in. So you need to have an infrastructure in the customer's organization to manage that ongoing change. A lot of times people talk about OCM as organizational change management. I think it was more the ongoing change management.
Right. So what we are saying is, customer success teams or whichever team is tasked with driving this change management exercise does not really control it completely, but is required to still guide, nudge, educate the customer, because without that, the outcomes are again likely to be challenged anyway.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think so.
Have you seen, is there a good way to plan for this, Sue and Jason? For example, is there merit in breaking this up into these are what the impact of this change means to your technical preparedness or your data model? This is what it means to your processes. This is what it means to your really day-to-day, how you operate. Today you are on Excel, tomorrow it means you are on a software. This is what this means, additional for you. Or is there merit in breaking this down? How do you normally plan for change management?
Absolutely. What we do is, particularly with the high touch customers, obviously what we're going to be describing now is more for high touch, more for enterprise customers and mid touch. You can start to automate things, but that we'll get to that perhaps at the end of the webinar. But really what we do, we use our framework. And our framework is exactly what you were talking about, Prithvi. It's called Optin. So what we do is we try and guide the customers as to what they should be doing in terms of perhaps reorganizing everything they're doing around the tool. So that could be anything from their responsibilities. It could be related to their incentives. We have customers who change their incentives saying, look, you must be using the tool, you must be doing this, that, and the other.
Right.
it could be their process. It's very rare that you have a software implementation where the processes are left untouched. So we should be helping them, guiding them. Okay, normally, this is what you should be doing in terms of your new process. The other thing, obviously the tool is obvious. This is what you should be doing in terms of adopting your tool. But the other thing which is really important is what Jason was referring to, is to change your behaviors. So you should be leaving behind your comfort zone, what you were doing before, and adopting new behaviors. To give you an example, we had a company, an insurance company, and they had a fantastic stakeholder who told the people who were adopting the CRM in question to change their behaviors and have a morning reflex. Every morning when you're drinking your cup of coffee, which I know you love as well, Prithvi, that's when you should be entering your agenda. So we saw peaks in adoption every morning at coffee time,
Yeah.
So that's an example.
Yeah, no, wonderful example, actually.
I think also,
yes.
Yeah, just to build on that, because I love the Optin framework and it's been so useful every time we've used it. Not everyone knows this, but a large portion of our business is actually working hands-on with buyers of software to help them implement change management and user adoption programs. So sometimes we partner with software vendors to help deliver these. I had one customer a few years ago was doing a very large, multi-million-dollar investment. So not your typical one, but it's very large. And they brought us in 6 months before they even selected their vendor. And they said change management and user adoption are going to be 80% of our problem. Our organization struggles with evolving, and to do this, we need to figure out how we're going to do this and execute and prepare for it. Technology can go faster than our people. And some things that we've also done there is we actually separate out what are the things that you can decouple from the technology implementation to start to make change before the technology even goes live. What are the items you have to do right around the go live piece during that initial onboarding and transition phase of a new software? And then what are the activities you need to do in that ongoing basis afterwards to really sustain and mature adoption and value over the long term and keep that going? And really breaking into phases, you can identify specific actions and activities that need to happen all the way through there that can really help accelerate adoption and success.
Sure. One follow-up question. I know there's a question also from one of the attendees on the Optin framework. So what you're saying is this is a framework which enables potentially customer stakeholders to actually provide for a reason why somebody should use it, or also guide them towards actually using the newer software in a certain way. And your example around the morning reflex, Sue, is around that. So how do you expand that a little bit more? Can you give us some more details around that Optin framework?
Yes, so that Optin framework is something for which we could provide some kind of, we often call it like a sponsor kit or stakeholder kit, with guidelines of what they should be doing as executives and managers of how to drive that internal change at their company. Because a lot of the time, we often hear if there's a user adoption issue, the immediate reflex is, oh, let's do another training for the users. And the training is not the reply to that issue, right? So what we are doing with the Optin is putting in guidelines of how managers should be behaving with their teams. So it could be, Jason gave a few examples, of how to build that buy-in by getting users involved, even with the selection of the software and the shortlist. It could be to get buy-in by explaining the awareness around why we are investing in this. What's it going to bring to us as a company? How it is aligned with our strategy? What's it going to bring to us as a team of users? And what it's going to bring to the individuals within those teams? That's the way that you get buy-in. And of course, we are dealing with human beings here. So every individual will have a different perception of this change. You'll have promoters, you'll have people who are reticent, and you'll have people who are sitting on the fence. The manager of that team, it's his job to identify those teams of people who are in those three buckets. And we will be helping them by giving them advice on what to do with the reticent population, you see. And one of the things that we're including in that sponsor kit, it could be a list of typical objections
Mhm.
and how to overcome those objections, for example. Yeah.
Sure. Wonderful. So it appears this is, and I think Jason, you mentioned it a little while back. This is a continuous process. This is not a passing phase, which you can say we have, done change management, now on to the next best thing. This
Right.
appears this is continuous for multiple reasons. Processes internally might change, your outcomes required might change. Your own software as a vendor might undergo some upgrades, changes, etc. itself, which again just sort of puts this in a continuous cycle, if you will. Any thoughts on that? Have you seen this being practically possible to run this in a continuous loop?
Yeah, I've seen a few things that actually work very well. And one is getting people at the executive level initially to recognize that this needs constant attention. And as I explain it and say is, the value that you get from your IT investments is just like the value you get from a financial investment in your retirement account. They can go up and it can go down, and you need to constantly adjust your portfolio and tweak to make sure you're always getting the outcomes that you want. So when a client asks me, oh, well, when should we stop our change or adoption effort? I'm like, well, when do you want to stop getting value from your IT investment? That's when you stop this, because that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So getting them first to recognize that continued effort is there, and that they need to assign a senior person to be accountable for ongoing adoption, ongoing change, and managing that process, so that someone has skin in the game who actually has the authority and resources to make it happen. So if you don't have that, you're dead in the water before you even start. And then what I usually throw out to people is, if you had to put together a project plan for how you're going to manage change and drive adoption and continued success over the next 3 to 5 years, could you do it? Do you know what tasks and effort you need there? Do you know where it's going to be? Do you know what sort of resources and skills you're going to need to maintain that? And that will vary by the size of your organization, the complexity of your product. But many times the answer is, well, no. So then the question becomes, how do you put in place a team or a structure that has the ability to monitor and listen for changes in adoption, changes in the product, changes in your organization, and all the things we've talked about, and can help drive that ongoing change effort accordingly? So it's really the have a vision where you're going, but pay attention to what's going on, and then have a means by which you can respond and influence folks away. And I think doing some of those things and putting that in place sets you up for long-term success, where, as we've talked about, if you view it as a one and done, or as we say, the go live and go home, and we did a little bit of training and a little bit of communications just focused on go live, you're going to be in problem. You're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, one follow-up question though I have is on the cost of managing this. Okay, so it's obviously good to do and it's a must to do, but there's also a cost associated with all the effort being put in. So where do you see these costs being allocated today? Is it part and parcel of CS operations in general, onboarding operations, account management operations, or is it factored in slightly differently and there's a separate budget, if you will, allocated to this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Prithvi. I mean, I've seen companies who have actually tried and experimented with including that as some kind of additional professional services type operation, which is paid for, of course, professional services. And I think as we go forward, and we're seeing, the root cause of a lot of lack of adoption of software is change management, is something which companies are actually looking into, to actually include it as part of the offerings of the customer success offerings. So of course, some of the examples we were saying, obviously that is more enterprise, but I've actually done this with some companies where you can provide a very simple sponsor kit and very simple tutorials or webinars, which are destined just for the sponsors and the stakeholders and the managers. So this is all part, it's like doing a video or tutorial for the product, right? But it's doing it so that you're guiding them as to what they should be doing in terms of change management. So that's not as costly as actually if you're sort of going with them and holding them by the hand,
Right. We are getting a few questions, so I'll just take a break here and also mention that on the Q&A icon, you could please go ahead, attendees, and put in questions. Okay. We'll spend the last 15 minutes taking and covering as much of these as we can. Getting into the crux of this webinar theme, which is mistakes in change management now. What are the most common ones you are seeing currently?
Oh God, I think there's quite a few out there. One is quite simply just not devoting resources or time to change management at all. I mean, I think that's the very first one that I see quite a bit out there. And just the whole "if you build it, they will come" assumption is always out there, which I think is a big mistake. I've also seen folks where the assumption is, oh, well, we'll just tell people they'll have no choice but to use the system and be mandatory. And that also doesn't work as well, too. There's a lot of ways and degrees of freedom around usage that get around things. But I think there's a lot of bad information out there about change management that really doesn't apply in the software world. And we've talked about the assuming it's training or tell people, just what's in it for me without having some other pieces out there. And I think one that I see all the time is that people really have the wrong messaging around change and adoption for technology. And one of the things that I recommend people take is there's kindness and clarity, and being very clear on what's expected of people going forward to be successful going forward. And many times people they don't know where they hem and haw, and they'll say, oh, we want you to use the system. Well, be more specific around that. We want you to do it, like Sue said, every morning at coffee time, put this in, give people something they can head for. But I think also that happens a lot is the messaging should really be around, we've invested in this new system because we're looking to change the way we operate and have better outcomes as a result of this. That means our expectations for success from you have now changed because we've given you new tools and processes that should make you and this company more successful. So here's what success now looks like. Here's what made you successful yesterday. It doesn't really apply. Here's what applies now. Here's how we're going to help you make this transition. And here's how we're going to help you do it over this time period. And if for whatever reason, this isn't the direction where you want your career to go, or this isn't something that you want to make for this transition, here's some alternatives. Whether it's we find you a different role in the organization, or we assist you saying, hey, maybe this is no longer the right organization because you're moving on in a different direction. But I'd love to see a lot more leaders just be very clear about that. And just it helps people to understand how big the change is and gauge their actions accordingly.
And just I agree as well, Jason. I would also add to that as well. I think that as vendors, we're not making it clear who is responsible for what.
Yeah.
So I think that we don't communicate well enough to the sponsors and the executives and the managers that they are responsible for driving that change. They don't know how to, so we obviously need to help them to understand how to do that. Because it's so easy if you don't have the adoption of your tool and the consequence outcomes of that, for the customer to come and point the finger to you and saying, look, it's the fault of your tool. And then the tool becomes the scapegoat for everything, because the tool is the tangible part of the iceberg. And we're not looking down underneath that iceberg at all those other elements, which are the real root causes of all the failure. So I think that accountability and making sure that that is well communicated, that's part of the sponsor kit, in fact, who's responsible for what is a key part. And I think for me, the other one as well is, I was talking about the tool being the emerged part of the iceberg. I think because it's the easiest part to communicate about, we are focusing just on the tool.
Agree.
And forgetting the rest,
Sue, I agree with that, and you remind me of a couple of things too. I think one of the other big ones that trips up a lot of organizations is they assume that people changing their behavior and how they do their job is entirely within the control of the individual. And how people choose to spend their time is absolutely within their control and where they choose to focus. But pretty much in every organization I've ever worked with, there are some organizational barriers that prevent people from making a change or adopting a software, even if they want to. And those are barriers outside of their control. It could be data, it could be access right, it could be competing priorities, it could be information they need not being available, all sorts of things outside their control, that if you don't have a way to identify those and escalate it to someone who can remove those barriers, there's nothing they can do. And what I usually say is, many times it's like, oh, it's user resistance. And I ask, well, how do you know that's resistance? What other explanations could there be? What's getting in their way? And usually when someone starts to throw around the idea that, oh, we have user resistance, that's usually a key that you should listen to, that you've got more work to do to figure out how to drive that change or remove the barriers or what it needs to be. It's not necessarily the user's fault.
Yeah, and like a lot of things, this obviously, let's assume that this is a responsibility of CS teams, and it should be, because you are the one expected to drive value. You are the one expected to actually guide the customer towards best usage and thereby reaching outcomes. Now, like other things, CS, have you also seen a challenge in teams spending enough time understanding, because every customer is different, their current state is different, so this cannot be a cookie cutter. So you may have a blanket sort of approach, but the current state might be different for different customers, and you have to obviously recalibrate the entire thing to that current state. So how do you address that challenge from a CS team standpoint?
I think so. I think that's part of it. I think a lot of the time we have, like, perhaps in certain companies, a one-size-fits-all approach. And so when we are onboarding the customers, even if we're just showing the tool, it's usually, okay, these are all the different possible functionalities that you can play with, instead of just having something which is very tailored from a kind of persona or jobs to be done kind of perspective, right? Again, I think it's obviously due to simplicity, due to cost, sometimes due to lack of resources that we're doing all that, right? But I think in order to be really impactful in terms of change management, we need to really understand our customers' needs and provide the guidance which is going to impact the change management with our customers based on those persona needs, the jobs to be done. And so that takes work to do, right?
Yep.
And so I think we have a tendency, everything which is difficult to do and to track and to put into place, obviously it's stuff which probably gets left behind, right? And so that's, I think sometimes as vendors, we choose facility over what is really necessary to do. Yes. Yeah.
There's one question, and I think it's the right time to actually bring that question in here as well. So you mentioned, so it's not always, it's a difficult thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. You'd have to, map every customer, figure out different sponsors, stakeholders, personas, jobs to be done, and then figure out this is the best way to actually, drive this change. And you don't get to drive this or institutionalize this if you are not measuring it. So how do you measure whether you are, doing good, bad, ugly at change management?
Yeah. We actually have a method which we call AM/PM. So morning and afternoon. AM means activity measurements and PM means performance measurements. So the performance measurement would equate with the outcomes as a result of the change management.
Right.
And the activity measurements are all the things which we are guiding our customers to put into place in order to reach those outcomes. So there's a correlation between the two, between the AM and the PM. And obviously you can't get to the afternoon if you haven't gone through the morning. So all those activity measurements are really key to measure. So we would be measuring them, we would put things into place, which would measure, for example, are the customers moving from doing their previous process to adopting the new process? And we would think about what can we measure. For example, the cup of coffee in the morning, that could be measured. And the same for the organization. An organization example would be, are the teams reaching the new incentives and compensation plans which we've put into place? That same company for the insurance, for example, they put into place a bonus scheme to make sure that their users were using to the full extent the tool within their scope, and that was measured, and they got a bonus as a consequence. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So the message really is there are ways to actually measure this, and it is not very different from your standard operational matrix anyway. So it's just how you view it and how you connect the dots back into. So change management in isolation will not work. So it's absolutely imperative that it gets connected to the outcome. So which is the PM part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Uh, uh, and we might take a few questions here. So one you mentioned is the incentive, as in that example, Sue, to actually motivate the stakeholders. So this probably I'm assuming is for the end users, but there are other stakeholders, there are decision makers. Somebody has purchased the product or the tool, somebody else is using it, and that communication itself doesn't trickle through that well. Why did we purchase it? What are we expecting out of it? So how do you create a incentive, or how do you motivate the entire hierarchy to actually participate in this change management exercise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the key is to really understand, well, first of all, understanding, why they've invested in this tool now. What is the trigger? What is the compelling events for investing now? And how they're going to measure, obviously, the outcome of this investment for that, and try and relate that to the strategic objectives, the business objectives, at least, of the company at the time, and make a correlation, a mapping between the business objectives right now, the strategy, and how your tool is going to contribute to that business goal or strategy. Okay. And then you can cascade down. Usually we talk about a sponsor cascade, and within the sponsor cascade you have the top stakeholders, you would have the budget owner, you would have the different managers of the teams, and you'll be trying to make a correlation of all the different KPIs and goals that they have in relation to the team. So a bit like how do leading indicators from the use of the tool feed into the lagging indicators, which are the KPIs of the different stakeholders in that cascade.
And a simple example of that, because I agree with that completely, Sue, is I was talking with one organization. They were implementing, and this was pre-pandemic, a Zoom type software in their organization, but they were very clear they were doing it because they wanted to cut down on travel costs. They wanted to accelerate communication, have more people involved, and accelerate some other time to get their product development moving. So they have a variety of business outcomes they were trying to achieve, and then trying to figure out how do we get each department to start to actually use these tools effectively. And that's pretty simple to say, look, here's what we're trying to achieve from a business, and give each department a target of, I'm going to reduce my travel costs by this much, or I'm going to show X number of meetings using this tool in here. And you can sort of have each department figure out on their own how they're going to achieve those business outcomes and be able to prove it through use of the tool. So you could show, we did 25 meetings using the tool this month. Last month we did 2. We had 75 trips with flights last month, costing this amount of money. Cut that in half. So you can do a mix of those activity metrics that Sue mentioned, but making them very tied to the business outcomes. But make each department have to prove it, and then as part of that change infrastructure we talked about, have them report up to show the impact that they're having and that they're hitting their targets and objectives.
Yeah, there is one approach we are trying internally ourselves, and I see a lot of parallels to what we are discussing here right now, is that of driving incremental value. So this value discussion is so hyped that you feel it is at the end of the tunnel, if you will, but it's not like that. What we feel is the value is obviously always incremental, so you have to figure out what is value in this time period. So is it a month, is it a quarter? And then it's a never-ending process. So as long as you have the customer, you have to continue showing value. It almost appears that change management is a lens through which you can actually view most CS operations, right from onboarding to kickoff. It should be through the lens of change management. I think one of the most common mistakes I have felt and seen and perhaps done myself is look at this in isolation, right? That you treat this as a separate project. It is not a separate project. It has to be ingrained in everything you do when you're interacting with the customer, because it's that important. You'd agree to that, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be, Jason was actually mentioning a little bit earlier on, it's something which should start right even before the customer has signed, right?
Yeah.
So even, when the customer is shortlisting the software vendors, they should already, the stakeholders who are making that decision should already embed change management in their approach by including and involving the people on the field who are going to be using that. I've seen so many times where a decision around a tool has been made by somebody who is probably sitting in an ivory tower.
Yep.
And who does not unfortunately have an inside out knowledge of what is happening on the field, right? So that is the biggest starting block disaster that you can have for the change management and the buy-in from bottom up, right? So that's an example. And you're right, I love what you said, Prithvi. It's a lens, because it's a lens which will then be embedded along the whole customer journey, and it's continuous.
And Sue, I think the two things that when I listen to you that pops into my head. One, I think even during the sales process, you should be assessing the experience, capacity, and willingness of your prospective customer to have in place a full change effort in their organization, and recognize that if they don't have the appetite or the resources for it or the experience to do it well, that's a risk for you. That's a risk that they will not get the value and that they will renew. It's a risk that it's going to need more of your time and resources, not your cost to serve. So maybe you want to factor that into your pricing or your expectations for how long this customer will be around. So I think that's definitely one thing. And then I think the other piece is then using that to assess how much effort and time will you need to spend, and how will you help your customer drive change and success in their organization. And I think, in the next 3 to 5 years, more and more CS teams that can demonstrate to prospective customers, here's our proven track record of helping our customers drive change and achieve success. That's going to be a competitive differentiator, and being able to say, we've done this is key to what we do, and this is key to us making you successful. If you're looking at similar tool sets at similar price ranges, and one has the track record of helping you drive change and success, and one doesn't, who are you going to go with?
Absolutely.
A few quick questions, and I'll try and combine a few here. I think we covered one. There's someone asking, how would you incorporate change management into the implementation phase? I think the message really is, it's not only restricted to a phase. You should actually sort of incorporate it in everything else also, but it potentially starts with the implementation phase. You might want to look at the state your customer is in, and then, as we discussed, key stakeholders, where they are, what are they thinking, how big is the gap between the buyer and the user, and that is the first thing to be covered, I think, likely.
It's a great question, because you're right, Prithvi, with implementation, it's not because you haven't actually made the tool available yet, because you're probably still doing some configuration, and if it's a complex tool, then it can take months, right, to do. However, what you should be doing is making sure that your stakeholders are preparing the ground for the people who are going to be using it and going to be impacted with its use later on, right? So that means, getting buy-in, making communication plans internally, why we're doing this, getting people excited, creating momentum around this, and not just, all of a sudden you find the next day you're going to be using a new tool, That's not the way it happens.
The other interesting question here is how to assess the readiness of an organization for the change. So is there ways which you can gauge how ready is the organization for that change? And it is a complex question, I think, because there are so many elements to that readiness. But what have you seen practically play out?
We've done quite a bit of this with some of our clients as well, too. And there's a variety of things that you can do, from going in and really understanding the organization and operations, and moving away from what's on paper to what's really happening there. So, doing interviews and focus groups and some of those things, surveying folks to understand their attitudes and beliefs, understand their knowledge of what's going on, understand their concerns of where the situation is, identifying all those barriers that prevent adoption, look for misaligned incentive systems, look for competing priorities. When you start to ask questions and you get used to listening, and you know which questions to ask, it pops up pretty quickly what the readiness is and where it isn't. And in fact, that organization where I said they brought us in very early, we ended up doing readiness assessment for every single one of the deployment sites to understand where this is and figure out how to scale that process as well too. And similarly, we've also had several customers come to us where they're already live, but they're suffering with bad adoption. So it's sort of a rescue and turnaround situation. what can we do that the system is live, they may make small tweaks to it, but they're not changing systems. How do they get more adoption value from it? And one of the first steps there is also to do that assessment. And it's no longer a readiness assessment, it's more of a, what is our current situation assessment and where do we go? And I think as part of that, making sure you ask people, what is it that you need to be able to achieve this, to take the behaviors that we want you to take? What's preventing you and what's driving you, and how do we make it happen? And let them tell you how to solve the problem. They usually have better ideas than you do.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have time for just about a few more. There's one. Do you have any advice on getting senior management or sponsors to take change management seriously and provide resources? It's a practical question,
I think that is actually, that's one of the things we assess. We're talking about the assessment, and that's one of the things that we do assess, because it is one of the biggest either, let's say success reasons or failure reasons for change management. So senior management, they're going to be the ones that are going to be setting the objectives for their teams. They're going to be setting the example as a role model for their teams. So we have to absolutely educate them and guide them as to what they should be doing. They are the ones that ever they get people within their teams who are resistant, there are always individuals who will be reticent to move forward. They're the ones that should having those one-to-one conversations with those team members to understand why. What is it? Jason was alluding to just now. Is it because there's an organizational barrier? Is it because they have a personal individual barrier? They're afraid to move out of their comfort zone? Is it because they don't feel that the incentive that they have related to whatever it is not correct? What is it? And it's only the senior management that can do that, right?
Yeah.
So they have to be educated. And I think the way software is going, because we have so much software, that is going to be a differentiator. So the companies that know how to do that, they will be the ones that will succeed most, I think. Yeah.
And it's a domino effect. So it's a great question, because if you actually have senior management genuinely on board, and I guess 70% of that battle is won right there.
Yeah.
And then the rest becomes executing well. But even to get them onboarded, there are motivators to be understood. The motivator at times can be outcomes like financial results, goals, some number going from certain percentage to certain percentage, etc., etc. It can also be a little bit more political in nature. It's land grab, or it makes them appear better. Either way, I think it's the role of the change management agent, in this case the customer success teams, to figure that piece out and then adjust accordingly. I think that's the language they need to speak when they connect with senior management, and give them enough motivation. Those are the motivation, some examples.
Absolutely. And a couple of questions I found helpful for that is, just when I speak to senior leaders that are considering an IT investment, I'm like, based on your projection, your business case of the value and the returns that you're going to get, what level of user adoption did you assume there? And many times they hadn't even thought about it. And I say, implicit in most assumptions is 100% user adoption from day one. What happens if you never get more than 80% effective adoption or 50%? How does that impact your business case? Does it break things down quite a bit for you? And then they're like, oh yeah, that really throws off our numbers quite a bit. We need to do something about that. And viewing change management as ROI insurance in some ways. The other thing that we've done with them, wow, I just lost all train of thought.
So no worries. One quick thought there, as you were speaking, Jason. So we have been spending this session largely talking about what does change management mean for a vendor who's selling into a customer, and this customer vendor equation. Now, a lot of questions I know are coming because there is an issue of internal communication within the vendor organization itself. Why should we invest in change management internally as a vendor organization? And I think that's a separate conversation, honestly, because if you're not aligned to this, then there is a bigger problem. Then you can't solve for a customer problem. If
Yeah.
the why of why you are
Yes.
doing it is not there internally, then it's a sort of HR cultural org hierarchy or communication problem, and probably a different forum for that. But I think it's a worthwhile problem to bring up, that it is something
Yes.
which needs to be solved first.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the biggest challenges, which I think a lot of customer success teams are finding, is this internal alignment. It's always a common challenge, I think. And that takes change management internally.
yeah, internally, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely, at the vendor. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the same cycle, if you ask me. It's still showing incremental value, still understanding motivations.
Yes.
There are ways you need to educate your CFO, CEO, CXO layer on value you are likely to generate, and it's part of the role. I mean, you can't run away from it.
It's an internal customer. It's not an external customer, but yeah, the same approach is applicable. Absolutely.
Wonderful. We have just about run out of time. Thank you, Sue, Jason. I think it was a great conversation. The recording we will circulate to anyone who has registered, and hopefully we addressed most of your questions. I know there are a few pending, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day, evening. Sue, continue the travelogues, and we'll catch you.
I'll send you a postcard, Prithwi, the next time. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Bye now. Take
Okay,
care,
thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.